Hey everyone, how's it going? Juan Dhas here, and welcome to part 2 of the lesson on what you can learn from Bach as an improviser. And specifically, even branching out from just an improviser, what ideas can you take and assimilate to help with your own development as a musician, period, from Bach. Now, if you haven't already, please do check out my performance of the G minor Presto from the First Violin Sonata and the part 1 I did for this series, which covers a little bit of the harmonic side of things, how Bach plays harmony, how Bach develops ideas, and how you can incorporate some of this from an improviser's perspective, as these are really fundamental skills that need to be worked on, and this runs through all the way from Bach to even modern music. Now, part 2, I wanted to cover a little bit about sound, touch, dynamics, and really performance considerations, basically. Things that sometimes do get lost in translation, because as I made a reference to in that video, especially those of us that come from a jazz background, we think a lot about data, as in what is the chord, what do we play over this chord, what do we play in this musical situation. To put it in really simple terms, we think of the what as opposed to the how. How is this note going to sound? How should I play this? How should I treat the dynamics? How should this be interpreted? I'm going to cover that a lot in this part. So the reason I wanted to do this part, and I'm going to give a plug again for my friend Kincho Kane, who runs Streetwise Guitar. He's a wonderful educator and has some incredible material on his channel and some really insightful interviews with great players and musicians. But he saw one of the clips I'd shared and specifically mentioned, you sound great, you're playing it wonderfully. It's an extremely hard place, but an extremely hard piece, but some of the notes aren't speaking as well as they probably should. And in that moment I realized, okay, I'd started to kind of fall into an older pattern, an older habit of just being more concerned about the notes. And something I've been working on a lot this year is really how to play the notes. For example, how can I be dynamic? What are the ranges of my dynamics? For example, that's the quietest I can play. It's very controlled and very subtle. Going all the way from there to much louder. And bear in mind my volume's like here, because I'm in a pretty small apartment. I usually keep my volume somewhere around 7 or 8. That's where I normally keep it for kind of these videos, this stuff, so it doesn't overload the mic or anything. So keeping my dynamics, how is my touch, my articulation, my phrasing? So I decided to go back to the Bach and really treat it from that perspective, not just the technique and getting the notes right. So I think the first place I want to start with is what can Bach teach us, and why I probably recommend students try Bach is it'll teach you about, well, an obvious thing, technique, but not technique in the commonly held belief of technique, that technique is just playing fast. I like to think of it like this. There are 2 levels of technique we all have access to. The first is your technical facility, period. How fast can you play? And then I find there's another level, which is your applied musical technique. And this is often what you can play in real-time musical situations, in a piece that's maybe through composed or as an improviser. And usually what's very common is the applied musical technique is a little lower to some degree or another, and some it's less noticeable than others, than the absolute musical technique, which I think we're always slowly trying to bring that more and more level. And it's something I was actually explaining to a student today, because he's like, yeah, I can play pieces, but when I improvise, it's not there. And the other thing about the musical technique that people forget is that this is also your ability to control dynamics in the moment, your touch, and your tone, basically. So with respect to the Bach, how does this make sense? Well, one very important element is tempo. when I tried this, my initial goal, which was really lofty and probably speaks a lot about the standards I kind of set for myself and really sometimes hit and sometimes don't. I wanted to be able to play it at the same tempo as a concert violinist. So think Hilary Hahn or Samina Studer or Ray Chan or so on and so forth, Rachel Podger. And I actually went and did a lot of research because I saw, as I started going through different versions, each one has a different tempo. There's another guy, I can't remember his name for the life of me, but he has a version that's blisteringly fast. You'll find it if you look up the G minor Presto. Although he takes liberties with the phrasing, whereas Hilary Hahn's is very precise and still at probably the upper end of the tempo, but incredibly precise and while still being musical. So I had to consider, okay, if that's my goal, what should I hit? And then as I started researching, I realized there was a large variation in tempo between the violinists. I'd say probably on the slower side of things was the Grumio. And that became kind of my inspiration because the minute I heard the Grumio interpretation, it became very apparent that there was more dynamics. Something in the touch was very particular. Every note really spoke, in air quotes. So when it came time to interpreting that, I realized, okay, maybe if I take it a little slower, then I'm not as worried about the musical aspect. And that became something to realize. My fingers can, theoretically speaking, can play at that tempo. They can play at that tempo. They can move at that tempo. But does that mean I should perform at that tempo if the musicality is sacrificed? Probably not. And maybe in the future, maybe it works up to that and I get a little more control and my musicality at higher tempos such as that improves. But I wanted to really preserve that as I was playing. That's something I urge. One thing, if you're taking Bach pieces, is take them really slow, especially the violin sonatas that are probably running eighth notes. Take them really slow. I would actually argue that's probably too fast to begin with. And see if every note is articulated. Right? That's the starting point. So, first thing Bach teaches is really consider our actual musical technique, and it'll help you work on that. Especially as you work the tempo up and up and up, you'll find that over time you will have more control. You will have more control at those faster tempos. And why is this? I find the great thing about the violin sonatas is that they put us in uncomfortable positions because we're not playing running eighths or running sixteenths all the time. So that's something to consider. And when we put ourselves in that situation, we're working our technique in a way that isn't usually done, whilst at the same time working on a lot of musicality. Speaking of musicality, one thing I also wanted to touch on that I learned through this was really a lot about interpretation. I think one of the pitfalls that especially jazz musicians can fall into is again pertaining to data as opposed to interpretation. Again, the full disclaimer, I'm not a classical musician, just someone who loves the music and thinks we can learn a lot from it. But one of the pitfalls I think that happens with jazz musicians playing classical music, especially Bach, is if you look at it, you see there's a lot of notes and your first instinct is probably, oh man, I've got to learn all of this. So then you put a lot of time into learning the notes and getting inside what maybe the actual harmony is, what are some of the harmonic devices used, right? For example, in the part 1, I was referring to, what was it? Yeah. Yeah. The descending seventh arpeggios. So you've got C minor 7, B flat major 7, A minor 7 flat 5, and then D7, and you keep moving through the harmony as is. So maybe we pick up on that, but as such, most jazz musicians can play it quite flat, which could be an interpretation in and of itself, but it lends Bach to sounding more like a clinical exercise as opposed to a piece of music. And one reason I think many teachers suggest musicians learn from Bach is that it's a musical way of approaching your technique. It's technically challenging, and there's so much great information there as far as learning about resolutions, learning about harmony, learning about melodic voice leading. But that's just because we ascribe it on a technical basis doesn't mean we shouldn't play it musically. You know? This stuff is such beautiful music, and there are such beautiful interpretations, and my friend Kinch really pointed this out, and it's something that I realized, yeah, it's actually a very good point. If you aim to present a piece in any way, shape, or form like this, I mean, don't treat it too much from an elitist perspective, but you have to consider the lineage of the piece and the history of all the great musicians that have played this piece. So, and especially if you portray that in, no matter from what world you come from, classical, jazz, or whatever background, you still have to get it to a certain level, and each note has to really speak. And how is that done? Through dynamics and articulation. So, touching on some specific things, because this has been quite conceptual so far. One thing that I think would benefit a lot of guitar players, by the way, this is really quite general, it can apply to any instrument, but this one specifically for the guitar players is your fingering. For example, I think many people who grow up from rock backgrounds are very used to rolling for arpeggios, whereas for pieces like this it doesn't quite work, because if I tried to roll, let me get a little more volume. It's actually very difficult. So this piece is a great way to work on playing things with different fingers, and for close fingerings, actually something I have trouble with. To get the clarity you need to phrase that, especially at faster tempos. Even the fluidity you need to ascend that arpeggio, or even in the beginning of the B section. Every note needs to ring out and really be heard. Right? And actually, what I mentioned earlier, working on really tight fingerings, is something I need to work on constantly, because my natural tendency is to play very wide fingerings. That's actually quite comfortable. Whereas when my fingers are really tightly squeezed together, I find, so to speak, my fingers tie themselves in knots at times, and I don't get as much clarity. One thing you can do to work on your dynamics is experiment, and this ties into the interpretation side of things. I really highly recommend you go check out Ray Chen. I believe he was doing a live stream specifically on this piece and the Siciliana, I think it was. Don't quote me on that, but it was definitely one half of the live stream was on the Presto. And he was talking about a lot of the dynamic considerations he would take, like, oh, because this section is a restatement, we're going to take this and do something new with it. Or think about the dynamic, or think about how we can go into the next section or the next phrase, or you see he's taking this phrase and moving it about, right? He was really paying a lot of attention to that, so I started thinking, okay, I really have to think about dynamics, especially for this piece. And because of the technique, it's very easy to fall out of that perspective and not think about dynamics. So one good exercise I found was play this as quietly as you can. Like, if you're a guitar player, get your volume knob to where you would normally play it, given your space, and try play it I find this is easier to do when you play it loudly. It's easier to overplay the dynamic, so to speak. Do the opposite. And it works on working to maintain intensity at very low dynamics. So somewhere like there. I'm playing this extremely quietly to the point where if I could talk over it, and I'm not talking particularly loudly. This is kind of a normal speaking volume. It could easily overpower what I'm playing. And what's this working on? This is working on our ability to play really quietly. And I'm doing this at a medium-ish tempo. Sorry. Extremely softly. It's a great exercise. And work on trying to be relaxed. There it is. It's an extreme. Would I play the whole piece like this? Absolutely not. Because it doesn't have some of the power the piece needs. But it allows you to work on your dynamic range. How soft can you play? How loud can you play? I would actually wager that most, I'm not saying everyone, most jazz musicians probably don't know that they can play quieter than they already play, or louder than they already play. And this is a way of getting into the dynamic state of mind. So then when it comes to playing it normally, let's get my volume up again, come on. There we go. Very clear. And I can shift into the quiet dynamics if I want to. Would I probably play that all the time? No, not really. Again, these are considerations that are very personal, and how you handle phrasing and dynamics is going to be very different to how I do it, to how a classical violinist would do it. Bear in mind, I am speaking again from more of a jazz background, but I think we as jazz musicians can pay more attention to that stuff. Now, lastly, bears without saying, we got to talk about tone and touch, and one of the important things I found out about this was that you need a very, very light touch. It has to be extremely light, otherwise you, especially on guitar, you don't get a lot of the definition, and you'll tire yourself out very quickly. So really keep a light touch, almost lighter than you would normally play. I have a very light touch to begin with, so I had to dial it back even more to be able to maintain some of that fluidity. And tone, you're really aiming for every note to come through, every note to have some sort of clarity to it. Now bear in mind, the reason I chose some of the fingerings, like those wide ones, because I wanted to maintain some of the slurs that were written in the score, in the sheet music. I was about to say chart. Can definitely show my background. But in the sheet music, so wherever I would play it legato and try to see if I could do that. And it just adds another tool to your arsenal. So in closing, I would just like to say, first, thanks for all the support on this video, the last one, and the Bach performance. It actually really means the world. And it was a very fun challenge to be able to take that on and also kind of hold myself to a standard and say, okay, look, what you would normally do won't cut it here. You've got to push further. So I really highly recommend all of you try and play through the violin sonatas and partitas, or really any Bach music. There's so much to be learned and so much that it can teach you. And in a way, Bach is kind of a hard teacher. It forces you into some very uncomfortable situations for the instrument, and stuff that isn't easy to play by any means or by any stretch whatsoever. So do enjoy it, do try it out. I highly recommend it. It's a great learning experience. And rather, just to leave with one closing piece of advice, don't play the piece as the means to an end. Try really get inside it, get inside it and take the lessons from the piece, as that will really shape your musical identity moving forward, because it will start to get you considering things that maybe you didn't consider before. Until then, take care, and I will see you in the next video.